Hello, dear viewers. In this, the third part of our video review, we will continue a detailed analysis of Russia's defeats in wars that it started itself. In the previous second episode, we analyzed in detail how Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Capitulated in World War I, received a defeat in the Soviet-Polish War of 1919 to 1921, lost its territories and paid Poland large reparations. In the second episode, we thoroughly analyzed the reasons and goals of Russia's start of these wars, and also showed how they ended for Russia. In this episode, we will continue our analysis. And we will consider such wars as the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940, also known as the Winter War. The Second World War of 1939 to 1945. Although officially Russia joined it only in 1941. However, in fact, it was a participant since 1939, but on the side of Germany. In fact, the beginning of the USSR's entry into the war can be considered its invasion of Poland, under an agreement with Germany. Under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on the division of Europe. Germany began the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, and the USSR invaded Poland on September 17 of the same year. It was then that Germany and the USSR occupied Poland together, dividing it between themselves. So, in fact, Germany and the USSR together unleashed World War II. It was thanks to this agreement that the USSR would attack Finland, and then annex the Baltic countries. So, in fact, the USSR was the aggressor, which, together with Hitler, unleashed a world war, and then suffered from its ally. We will find out why the USSR was defeated by Germany, and who and how saved it, and why it ended up among the victors in World War II. We will also consider why former allies became enemies, and how the Cold War between the USA and the USSR began. Next, we will consider the Korean War, on the territory of which the USSR, China, the USA, and UN troops clashed. We will learn about the role of the USSR in this war, and why it can be considered the main instigator of this war. We will consider what goals and objectives the USSR, led by Russia, set, and what were the results of that war. Why Russia and its allies lost it. In general, it will be interesting. And we begin our review with the Soviet-Finnish War, where Finland became the first target of the USSR's attack, after many years of peace in Europe. As we already clarified in the previous series, in 1921 the USSR suffered a major defeat in the Soviet-Polish War. As a result, it effectively lost the ability to wage war for 20 years. And so, when it recovered and was ready for war, its target was Finland. The territory and population of which were orders of magnitude smaller than those of the USSR and Russia. The same applies to the armies of the countries. Therefore, the Soviet command thought that it would be a short and victorious war. But as history has shown, it was very much mistaken. Moscow's goal was to seize all of Finland. That is why a puppet pro-Soviet communist government was created in the country. After the revolution and the change of power, the country would immediately become part of the USSR. This is also evidenced by the Soviet propaganda of that time. It never said anything about it being a war. Expressions such as the Finnish campaign of the Red Army, the Liberation Campaign in Finland, the fight against the White Finns in 1939 to 1940, and the like were used everywhere. But the very fact of such expressions indicates that it was a full-scale invasion. And its goal was the entire country, not some separate territories. The fact that the USSR's goal was to seize all of Finland is also evidenced by the fact that the USSR troops attacked it along the entire length of the Soviet-Finnish border. If the USSR wanted to attack only the region called Karelia and push back the border there, then there would have been no point in attacking Finland everywhere. And in the very north, and in the center, and in the south. In that case, the USSR would have attacked only in the south, in Karelia, and would have pushed back the border there by force. Here is a map of the USSR invasion. As you can see, the USSR attacked literally everywhere it could. That is, it attacked on a full scale. And they only attack like that in one case, when they want to capture a country completely. This is a full-scale war. This is not a local war for some separate areas of territory. You see, the troops in the north wanted to capture the entire north. And a little further south they moved towards Sweden. They wanted to cut Finland off from neighboring Sweden. Even further south, the Soviet army wanted to go deeper and capture the central part of the country. Well, the southern armies first had to capture Karelia, and then move on to the capital, to the city of Helsinki. That's why they attacked on a full scale. Of course, when the USSR was defeated, what else could it say? That it attacked itself and lost the war? And did not achieve its main goals? No. That is why the USSR invented fairy tales about how they wanted to seize only Karelia and wanted to move the border there. However, in reality, moving the border was just a pretext for starting a full-scale war. Previously, there was no pretext to attack Finland. Therefore, a pretext was needed. So the USSR came up with it. By declaring that they wanted to move the border. The USSR knew that Finland would not agree. It is a sovereign and independent country. And then some barbarians wanted to take its territory. Of course, Finland refused. And when Finland refused, the USSR attacked on a full scale. And when the Red Army was defeated, the USSR immediately declared that they did not plan to seize all of Finland. Well, what else could they declare after their defeat? Therefore, in fact, the goal of the USSR was extremely clear. It was to seize the entire country in accordance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and the USSR. It was under this treaty on the division of Europe that Germany would begin an invasion of Poland, and then the USSR would invade Finland and the Baltic countries. In military terms, Germany's campaign would be successful. And the USSR's campaign would end in failure. Although later, after the failure in Finland, the USSR would conduct a successful military campaign in the Baltic countries, annexing them. The Baltic countries would not be able to defend themselves the way Finland did. Therefore, they would fall under Soviet occupation. But this was still a long way off, because first the USSR decided to seize Finland. As a result, under various pretexts, the USSR began an invasion of Finland. On November 28, the denunciation of the Non-Aggression Pact with Finland was announced. On November 29, 1939, an attack on Finnish border guards was noted in some areas of the border. And on November 30, the Soviet army attacked Finnish units on the Karelian Isthmus and other areas of the Soviet-Finnish border. Thus began the Soviet-Finnish War. In response to this aggression, the USSR was expelled from the League of Nations on December 14, 1939. The immediate reason for the exclusion was the mass protests of the international community regarding the systematic bombing of civilian targets by Soviet aviation, including the use of incendiary bombs. I would like to draw your attention to how this was discussed in the Soviet Union. Thus, Soviet newspapers called the goal of the war not the security of Leningrad, but the liberation of Finnish workers from the yoke of capitalists. It was under these slogans that Russia had previously occupied Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia. And then it wanted Finland as well. And it was under these slogans that the USSR would begin its invasion of the Baltic states and occupy them. Another important aspect. Here is a map of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on the division of Europe between Germany and the USSR. On the left are the plans for dividing Europe. And on the right are the actually achieved goals for dividing Europe. As you can see, everything in brown was given to the USSR. It included Finland, the Baltic countries and half of Poland. And Germany received the western part of Poland and Lithuania. However, Germany refused Lithuania. Apparently, because in the future, Hitler was already planning to attack the USSR and then capture not only Lithuania, but also most of the countries of Europe. Now let's look at the plans for dividing Europe. Western Poland, according to the plan, was given to Germany. So Germany captured it. According to the agreement, Eastern Poland was given to the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union occupied it in 1939. Look, the Baltic countries were also given to the USSR according to the agreement. And Soviet troops occupied these countries. And in the same way Finland, according to this treaty, went to the USSR. This once again confirms the fact that the goal of the USSR was the complete capture of this country. And all the statements that the goal of the war was some kind of capture of Karelia are just fairy tales of Russian propaganda. It was precisely such arguments that were very often stated in the USSR, and then on the territory of Russia. After the USSR actually lost the Winter War, without achieving the main goals in it. Therefore, to say that the goal of the war was Karelia, in order to move the border away from Leningrad, is, at the very least, very, very stupid. After all, at the beginning of the war, all Soviet media openly said that the goal of the war was the so-called liberation of all of Finland. This means that the main goal of the war was all of Finland. But the USSR was unable to capture and occupy it. The Soviet army suffered a large-scale defeat there. It lost more than 400,000 of its soldiers there. These were huge losses. It is also important to note that there were major inaccuracies with the USSR's losses in the war with Finland. They were resolved only after the collapse of the USSR. So, under the USSR, the military command stated that the Red Army's losses in the war were 127,000. And also 265,000 wounded. But this is the Soviet Union. How could it publish the truth? For some reason, the USSR always underestimated losses, and as a rule, very much so. So, after the collapse of the USSR, many archives related to this war were opened. It turned out that the Red Army's losses were 168,000 people. And sanitary losses were 265,000. Of these, 22% were from frostbite. All these are losses known by name. 168,000 for 3 months of war, this is a lot. As an example, the US losses in the entire Second World War amounted to 418,000 people. Plus 672,000 wounded. In total, this is more than 1 million soldiers. But these are losses for all the years of the war in the Pacific and European theaters of military operations. And here, the USSR lost 168,000 of its soldiers in just 3 months, fighting with one small Finland. The USSR also received another 265,000 wounded soldiers. In total, this is 433,000 soldiers. These are simply incredible losses. Moreover, these were shameful losses for the USSR. Because the small Finnish army lost many times fewer soldiers. Thus, the Finnish Ministry of Defense stated in 1940 that the losses of the Finnish army were 23,000 people and 43,000 wounded. Accurate calculations, when studying archival data in the 1990s and later, showed that the losses of the Finnish army were 26,000 people and 43,000 wounded. In total, this is 69,000 people. Against for 33,000 for the USSR. This was a real disgrace for the Soviet army. In fact, the USSR took it by numerical superiority. These were real so-called meat assaults of the infantry. But they failed to break through the defense and capture the country. Therefore, the USSR was forced to end the war. To avoid further disgrace in front of the entire world. Therefore, the Soviet Union had to be content with only those border territories that it was able to capture during the invasion of Finland. This was not a victory. It was a shameful defeat for the USSR. After all, the main goal was failed. But for Finland, this was a real major victory. After all, the country remained free and independent. Finland defended its independence on the battlefield. It avoided Soviet occupation. Although it lost part of its border territories. It was difficult for Finland to fight against such a large neighbor. Therefore, it was forced to agree to a truce. However, with the goal of returning its territories later, when the USSR clashed with its main ally, Germany. But this will be later. In the meantime, the USSR has just launched a full-scale attack on Finland with the goal of completely capturing it. Let's now see how it happened. It is noteworthy that the Russian army was many times superior to the Finnish army in the number of soldiers and an order of magnitude in the amount of equipment. For example, the Finns had only 14 divisions, and the USSR deployed 24 divisions against them. It should be noted that the Soviet division, in terms of the combined firepower of machine guns and mortars, was twice as powerful as the Finnish one. And in terms of artillery firepower, it was 3 times as powerful. The Finns also had only 64 tanks. 32 British Vickers MKE model of the 1930s and 32 Renault Foot tanks from the First World War. All these tanks were mainly used as stationary firing points. There was not enough fuel for their mobility, and the terrain did not allow it, especially in winter. But the USSR had 1,476 tanks at its disposal. Many of them were much more modern. In total, the Soviet Army had 2,289 tanks. Against 64 tanks of the Finnish Army, which were already outdated at that time. The situation was similar with aircraft. The USSR had an aviation fleet consisting of almost 2.5 thousand aircraft. And Finland had only 130 aircraft. Thus, in terms of technical equipment, the USSR was superior to Finland by orders of magnitude. But with such a huge advantage, the USSR lost the war. The Finns used the tactics of deep defense and guerrilla warfare. Western countries also provided military assistance to Finland. It received the necessary raw materials, weapons, and materials for defense against the Soviet invasion. As a result, almost all offensives of the Russian army ended with its encirclement and retreat. The USSR was able to capture only some border areas of Finland. At the same time, the Russian army suffered crushing losses. It could not continue the war any longer. Moreover, the Finnish defense was strengthening, the country was receiving more and more military aid from its allies. Even Germany, despite the alliance treaty with the USSR, was able to provide great assistance to Finland. Despite the fact that Germany and the USSR had already managed to divide Europe and signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on its division. But Germany wanted to use Finland in its own interests, and the USSR wanted to capture it. As a result, the USSR received a trade embargo on many types of weapons and cooperation in the military industry with developed countries of the world. In particular, with the United States. Thus, Germany became the main supplier of machine tools and equipment for the USSR industry. And therefore, it had a great influence on the Soviet leadership. In addition, France and Great Britain seriously began to consider the possibility of landing their contingents in Norway and Sweden with their subsequent movement to the east to support Finland. This greatly frightened the leadership of the USSR. After all, his army couldn't cope with even one Finnish defense. And the Finnish armed forces were many, many times inferior to the French or British, both in quantity and in quality of equipment. Plus, all attempts by the Soviet army to attack Finland ended in failure. And the world saw it all. The image of the USSR's might fell sharply. The military campaign had to be ended urgently. There was no way the USSR could win this war. But military, economic, and political losses were constantly increasing. Along with them, the military image of the USSR was falling. As a result, a peace treaty was signed in Moscow on March 12. The war lasted 3 months and 12 days. The USSR retained some of the previously captured Finnish territories and also received some of the border territories. This would automatically make Finland an ally of Germany in a future war with the USSR. Because in this way Finland wanted to return the territories previously occupied by Russia. At the same time, the attempt to capture all of Finland or at least establish a puppet pro-Soviet regime in it completely failed. And the country became an enemy of Russia for many years. Moreover, friends, before you is an extension of the Non-Aggression Pact between the USSR and Finland. This additional protocol was signed on April 7, 1934. The countries pledged not to attack each other until December 31, 1945. That is, in fact, at the time of the USSR's invasion of Finland, a non-aggression pact was in effect between the countries until 1946. And the USSR violated it. This once again shows the fact that Russia always violates all the treaties it signs. And all the treaties with it are not worth the paper they were signed on. The defeat of the USSR in the war with Finland led to geopolitical changes in Europe. The Finnish army was many times inferior to the Soviet army. But it was able to repel a full-scale invasion and defend the country's independence. Therefore, the world began to talk about the weakness of the Soviet army and the weakness of the USSR as a whole. Thus, at the beginning of January 1940, the German envoy to Helsinki, Blücher, presented a memorandum to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the following assessments, I quote. Despite its superiority in manpower and equipment, the Red Army suffered one defeat after another, leaving thousands of people in captivity, losing hundreds of guns, tanks, aircraft and, crucially, was unable to conquer territory. In this regard, it is necessary to reconsider the German ideas about Bolshevik Russia. The Germans proceeded from false premises when they believed that Russia was a first-class military factor. But in reality, the Red Army has so many shortcomings that it cannot cope even with a small country. Russia in reality does not pose a danger to such a great power as Germany. The rear in the east is safe, and therefore it will be possible to speak with the gentleman in the Kremlin in a completely different language than it was in August-September 1939. For his part, Hitler, following the results of the Winter War, called the USSR a colossus with feet of clay. Perhaps this war was one of the reasons for such a quick attack of Germany on the USSR. Also, this war should not be considered a separate local war. Rather, it was a separate episode in the Second World War. After all, several months earlier, the Second World War had already begun in Europe. So, on September 1, 1939, Germany began an invasion of Poland. This attack was never called a war in Germany, because they were afraid of Great Britain and France entering the war prematurely. Therefore, all German propaganda pointed to active defensive actions, defensive measures, defensive military operations against Polish aggression, etc. But everyone knew that it was a war. And most importantly, they understood the goals of this war. Therefore, in response to this German invasion, on September 3, France, Great Britain, Australia and New Zealand declared war on Germany. They were followed by Canada, the Union of South Africa, Nepal and a number of other countries. This is how World War II began. Thus, since 1939, Germany fought against the Western Allies in Europe and a number of regions of the world. And the question arises: what does the USSR have to do with it? And why can the USSR be considered the instigator of this war? It's simple. The USSR and Germany became allies before the war. They not only signed a non-aggression pact, but also became allies, and began to help each other in confrontation with other countries. This is what opened the way to a new large-scale war. It is known that Germany wanted to establish control in Central Europe, then capture Western European countries. And then, for dessert, capture the Soviet Union. But first, it had to defeat France and Great Britain, the main opponents in Europe. And the USSR began to willingly help it in this. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. This is a non-aggression treaty between Germany and the USSR. It had a secret protocol. According to the document, it defined the spheres of influence of the two states in Europe. These spheres of influence are very well illustrated on this map. One clarification: Germany also transferred Lithuania to the sphere of influence of the USSR. It was transferred knowing that soon all these lands would be German, when Germany went east against the USSR. For example, in the Russo-Finnish War, German diplomats persuaded Finland to make peace with the USSR in exchange for the loss of part of the territory. There they indicated that this would be temporary. And they offered Finland to be on Germany's side in the future war with the USSR, which Finland accepted. In general, according to the protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Germany and the USSR divided all of Europe between themselves. If this treaty had not existed, Germany would not have risked starting a war against France and Great Britain, knowing that the USSR could help them. And vice versa, Germany could have been afraid to attack the USSR, knowing that it could receive help from France and Great Britain. In general, everything was as it was in the First World War. But the alliance treaty between Germany and the USSR changed the balance of power in Europe. And that is why Germany began aggression against Poland. Next on the list were France and Great Britain. And the USSR invaded Finland and then annexed the Baltic countries. After the occupation of Poland by Germany, it was divided approximately in half. The western part became part of Germany, and the eastern part was occupied by the Soviet Union. Thus, the military allies together divided and occupied Poland. That is why the USSR can be considered the instigator of this war. Here is a map of how Germany attacked Poland. The Polish army resisted as best it could, but it could not repel such a powerful army, and such a modern one at that time. The Polish army was defeated and Germany began to occupy the western part of Poland. All under the Treaty on the Division of Europe with the USSR. But on this map you can see how the Soviet armies invaded the eastern part of Poland. They occupied all of eastern Poland. Again, all under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And this is a photo of a meeting of German and Soviet soldiers at the border of the division in Poland. Thus, the Allies divided Poland in half and effectively started the Second World War together. The Western democratic countries of Europe and their allies declared war on Germany. But they were in no hurry to declare it on the Soviet Union. Perhaps they did not want to start a war against Germany and the USSR at the same time. Or perhaps they understood well that a future war between the USSR and Germany was inevitable. And that very soon the USSR would ask Western countries for help. Therefore, the USSR actually did not meet resistance from Western countries. And it continued its campaigns in Finland and the Baltic countries. Although during the campaign in Finland there was a possibility that Western countries could declare war on the USSR by sending their troops to defend Finland. And the USSR did not want this. Therefore, perhaps this also influenced the quick peace treaty with Finland, which saved the country from Soviet occupation. But as history shows, Russia has always lost all the wars it started. The only exceptions were cases where it had a strong ally or allies. That's what happened in World War II. Germany continued military actions against the countries of Western Europe, and the USSR began to help it with resources and food. It turned out that while the Western allies were fighting Germany, the USSR was its ally and helped it in this war in every possible way. But everyone understood that sooner or later, the USSR would still clash with Germany. Two empires, two aggressors, could not exist side by side. Apparently, the USSR was preparing to attack Germany when it was bogged down in battles in France and Great Britain, and most importantly, when the United States entered the war on the side of the Western Allies. Then Germany would be maximally vulnerable. It would have to fight on two fronts at once, as it did in the First World War. Only this time, Germany's Eastern Front would not be fortified and unprepared for war. After all, the attack had to be unexpected. In this case, the USSR would have a chance to seize territories in Europe together with the Western Allies. And most importantly, a chance not to be conquered by Germany itself. Therefore, the Soviet Union needed allies to fight Germany. But the USA was in no hurry to get involved in the war in Europe. The war was going on, Germany was capturing more and more territories, entire countries. As a result, the only major enemy of Germany in Western Europe was Great Britain. Germany began to control almost all of Western continental Europe, most of its opponents were defeated. Now, a large number of German armies were free and ready to move on. Only this time, to the east. Since the USSR itself was preparing for war, its armies were concentrated at the borders. Germany took advantage of this. It was able to forestall the Soviet invasion and attacked first. This invasion was unexpected for the USSR. As a result, the main armies, equipment, were surrounded, found themselves in cauldrons. This was a disaster for the Soviet Union and Russia. The ally they wanted to attack got ahead of them and attacked first. Before the German attack, the USSR concentrated impressive forces near the borders. The Soviet army had many times more weapons and equipment than the German one. I will give a simple example. At the time of the German invasion, the Soviet army had 24,488 aircraft, while the German army had only 6,852 aircraft. The USSR had 25,481 tanks. Germany had only 6,292 tanks. These figures give us an understanding of how many times the USSR outnumbered Germany in weapons. And only these figures give an understanding of the fact that the USSR did not accumulate so much equipment for defense. It produced it for the offensive. This is all offensive equipment. And its quantity spoke of the scale of the planned invasion. Apparently, the USSR wanted to start a war and wage it on enemy territory. But the enemy got ahead. As a result, most of this equipment was right at the borders. And during the attack, the German army began to destroy all these weapons at airfields and deployment and storage bases. All this became an easy target for Germany. In the first hours and days of the war, the USSR lost almost all of its weapons and equipment. All these many thousands of planes, tanks, and other equipment were lost. The German army was replenished with a huge number of trophies. In fact, the Soviet army was destroyed. And now for defense, mobilization, and construction of defensive structures deep in Soviet territory were required. Since the Soviet army could no longer attack anyone, it was defeated. The Soviet Union now needed weapons and equipment to arm the mobilized soldiers. And where to get all this? Everything was destroyed on the border. Without outside help, the Soviet army was essentially kaput. And the transfer of troops from the Far East could not correct the situation. It took a long time, and it was not enough for a war with such a powerful enemy as Germany. And there was no time to produce at factories. It was also possible to produce ammunition. But time was needed to build tanks and planes. And at the same time, the German army continued its blitzkrieg. It advanced and captured more and more new territories. And the USSR was losing more and more of its armies and military equipment. All border equipment and weapons prepared for the attack were lost. What can we say if Soviet planes did not even have time to take off? They were destroyed right on the airfields. Germany also struck at fuel and ammunition depots, leaving Soviet planes and tanks without fuel and ammunition. Very often, tanks and artillery did not have ammunition. Or there was only enough fuel for a day of work. In general, the low level of organization of the Soviet army played its role. There was complete confusion in the army. No one knew what to do, who should go where, etc. Also, the Bolsheviks carried out large-scale purges and repressions in the army after the revolution. So the army lost many qualified personnel. Most of them were repressed for political reasons. And new officers did not know how to manage the army. This dealt a crushing blow to the combat capability of the Soviet army. All this manifested itself literally in the first hours after the German attack. As a result, the Soviet army began to flee and retreat en masse. And everything would have ended with the defeat and occupation of the Soviet Union by Germany. But the Western Allies interfered again. First, the United States entered the war. And at that time they produced more than half of the gross product of the entire world. The American economy went on a war footing and quickly began to produce a huge amount of weapons and equipment. They began to be supplied to the Soviet Union, which was on the verge of capitulation and could not stop the German offensive. This saved the USSR from capitulation and gave it the opportunity to defend itself. Lend-Lease also saved the USSR from starvation. And only thanks to this aid, the USSR was able to organize a counteroffensive and begin to help the Western Allies. The photo shows the total amount of aid under Lend-Lease that the USA supplied to the USSR. This is more than 22,000 aircraft, 13,000 tanks, 608 warships, 32,000 motorcycles, about 2,000 locomotives for railway trains. Also more than 11,000 cars for them. Also 622,100 tons of rails for railways were delivered. 376,000 trucks and cars. This is more than the USSR produced during the entire period from its creation to the end of World War II. So all transportation, all army supplies, transportation of soldiers, ammunition, and artillery, all this was done at the expense of these American cars. They gave the Soviet army the opportunity to be mobile and conduct not only defense, but also offense. Also 3,600,000 tires were delivered. And at that time rubber had not yet been created and tires were made of rubber. The USSR did not have it. Also 472 million shells and cartridges for small arms were delivered. The USSR received 2,100,000 tons of petroleum products. 400,000 tons of copper, 2,800,000 tons of steel, 328,000 tons of aluminum, 38,100 metalworking machines. It was on them that T-34 tanks and others were produced, shells were manufactured. On these machines, gun barrels for tanks were cut, and in general, weapons and equipment, ammunition were produced. And American rubber was also used for tank rollers. The USSR received from the USA almost 1 million detonators for ammunition, 127,000 tons of gunpowder. More than half of all explosives for ammunition used in the USSR were supplied by the USA. More than 2 million telephones for communication. And also a huge amount of cable for them. Also, the USSR did not have enough clothes for its soldiers. This especially concerned shoes. Therefore, the USA supplied this too. Also, the American Lend-Lease saved the USSR from starvation. Ukraine was captured, and the main volumes of grain and other food supplies were there. Famine began in the USSR. The USA supplied 794,000 tons of grain, 664,600 tons of canned meat, 238,000 tons of frozen meat. In general, the USA supplied the USSR with everything it needed, if only it did not capitulate. So that it could at least somehow help the Allies. And most importantly, so that it was not captured and Germany could not gain access to the enormous resources on its territory. Otherwise, the Allies would have to fight a new powerful and technologically advanced empire. They could not allow this, so they helped the USSR as best they could. And while the Soviet Union held out, the Allies managed to win a victory in the skies. First over Britain, then over the entire Atlantic, and then over the European continent. Victory in the skies led to victory at sea, in the Atlantic. All this led to the fact that soon, the Allied bombers began to bomb industrial centers and factories in Germany. Entire cities came under bombing. Often, after such raids, only ruins remained. In such conditions, the outcome of the war was a foregone conclusion. The German industry could not provide the army with the necessary equipment, weapons, and ammunition. As a result, the German army received less and less weapons and ammunition. It had nothing to continue the war with. Meanwhile, the USSR, on the contrary, received a lot of supplies from the USA and was ready for a counteroffensive. It was then that the retreat of the German army began. Especially in conditions when the Germans no longer had time for the Eastern Front and not for Russia. They did not care about what was happening somewhere there far away on the Eastern Front. In those wild fields and forests, deep in the territory of the USSR. Because for Germany it was more important to save its population, its cities, and industry from destruction and devastation during the bombings of the Western Allies. All the attention and forces of the German army were directed at countering air raids by bombers, attempts to destroy supply convoys at sea, and restoring industry after the bombings. Let me give you a simple example. How much high-quality steel and other resources were needed to create one submarine, which intercepted Allied convoys at sea? And how many tanks and other armored vehicles could have been made instead of this one submarine, but these tanks and weapons could have been sent to the Eastern Front? But Germany was forced to build submarines. Why? To disrupt the supply from the USA to its allies. Also, how much money was spent on creating interceptor aircraft and air defense systems in general, which protected against Allied air attacks? But all these funds could have been used to supply the Eastern Front, supply the Eastern land armies. But Germany was forced to build aircraft and air defense to repel the bombing of its cities by the Western Allies. The USSR practically did not participate in the war at sea at all. However, as in the war in the sky, its entire fleet had previously been destroyed or was standing in ports, afraid to go to sea so as not to be sunk. The USSR had virtually no bombers. The main focus was on interception and attack fighters, which were supposed to somehow resist German air raids. Moreover, the aviation in the USSR was often represented by plywood fighters. They were really made of wood. For example, the U-2 had plywood-covered wings. And the large EG-3 had a wooden frame and wood and plywood sheathing. At the same time, Germany had already begun producing the world's first jet Messerschmitt Me. 262, and all to repel attacks by Western Allied bombers. Also, the USSR's aviation was saved by the United States. It was the supply of a large number of more modern American aircraft that gave the Soviet Union the ability to defend itself in the sky. So it was not the USSR that won the war, even though it made the largest contribution in soldiers. Because it was poorly equipped and could only fight with bloody assaults. The war was won in the skies, and it was primarily the Western Allies, led by the United States, that did it. And the USSR helped them, drawing off most of Germany's ground forces. That is why the Allies won overall. Each of them made their own contribution to the victory. But the US contribution was dominant. The same situation occurred in the Pacific theater of military operations. As soon as Japan's last aircraft carrier was sunk, the Allied counteroffensive began, dominated by the US. And Japan began to retreat and eventually capitulated. So the entire Second World War was decided in the skies. Hence the proverb, whoever wins in the skies wins the war. So, as we can see, the USSR actually lost the war to Germany. It was saved from defeat and capitulation by the Western Allies, led by the US. Now the author would like to draw your attention once again to the importance of Lend-Lease for the USSR. We have talked a lot about the large volumes of supplies, resources, weapons, and equipment that enabled the USSR to survive the war. Now let's look at what the USSR began to attack in this war. And what the USSR attacked with when the German army retreated. In the photo is an American fighter Bell P-39 Airacobra. This is it in the Soviet army. It was supplied to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. And these are Soviet pilots near a British Hawker fighter. Hurricane. It was also supplied to the USSR. The following photo shows the transfer of frigates from the US Navy to Soviet sailors. 1945. And these are Soviet pilots accepting the American medium bomber Douglas A-20 Boston. The USSR received many of these aircraft. The next photo shows the preparation of British Spitfire fighters, supplied under Lend-Lease, for transfer to the Soviet side. King Cobra fighters accepted by the USSR under Lend-Lease. Fairbanks, Alaska. The next aircraft presented is an American Curtiss P-40 fighter received under Lend-Lease in the Soviet Army at a winter field airfield. And these are Soviet artillerymen on the march. American jeeps are used. They tow 45mm anti-tank guns. In the photo, Wehrmacht soldiers with convoys surrender to the troops of the Soviet Third Belarusian Front on the Frisch and Nerungspit. On the right are Soviet soldiers in an American Dodge WC-52 Jeep. And these are Soviet soldiers advancing on American Dodge WF-32. They are pulling anti-tank guns behind them. And these are units of the 1st Ukrainian Front on the march near the city of Rosenberg. January 1945. They are driving American Ford G8T vehicles. And behind them you can see an American Jeep. And these are Soviet Katyusha MLRS, mounted on the platform of American Studebaker vehicles. And next to them is another American Jeep. The equipment we present is only a small part of what was supplied to the USSR under Lend-Lease. The Allies supplied the Soviet Union with a great deal of diverse equipment and weapons. In front of you is the Soviet army driving through Romania. And what do we see? These are American Army Jeeps Willys MB. They pull 45mm anti-tank guns and transport soldiers. What would the Soviet military do if there were no such vehicles? How would they pull these guns and how would they transport soldiers? Would they use donkeys, horses, or cattle? Or would the soldiers pull it all by hand, on foot? After all, there was a critical shortage of cars in the USSR. And this same vehicle is transporting a heavy Maxim machine gun and infantry. And then, we see again the transportation of infantry with an anti-tank rifle. The USSR received 52,000 of these vehicles from the USA. If there were no such supplies, how would they transport all this? Let's move on. In the same column in Romania, we also see a column of American trucks. They are transporting large-caliber artillery and soldiers. And here are the Soviet troops entering Bucharest, the capital of Romania. American trucks are pulling a 122mm howitzer and are also transporting Soviet soldiers. This is a Studebaker US-6. It was produced from 1941 to 1945. This vehicle was the most widely produced vehicle supplied to the USSR. Under Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union received 116.5 thousand of these trucks. Also, tens of thousands more vehicles were assembled from American vehicle kits at Soviet factories. What would have happened to the Soviet army if it had not received these trucks? Would the USSR have been able to withstand the defense? And would it have been able to attack? Here is an example of the Soviet army before Lend-Lease. These are Soviet soldiers pulling a cannon on horses. Now do you understand how and what the Soviet army was provided with before the American Lend-Lease? And what did it use for transportation? What is the mobility of such an army? And how much can you fight like that? Although the Soviet Union did not have enough cars, and even after Lend-Lease, the Soviet army often continued to use horses, donkeys, cattle, etc. All because of the lack of cars. The United States supplied hundreds of thousands of cars and trucks to the USSR. Without them, it would not have been able to fight effectively. And even more so, to attack. They saved the USSR from defeat and capitulation, and they gave the Soviet army the opportunity to attack. All this was done by the Western Allies, led by the United States. And this is the Soviet army entering the city of Vienna, the capital of Austria. And what do we see? Again, the Soviet army on American trucks. And here in the city are American Sherman tanks. So this is what the Soviet army was attacking in Austria with. And it still had to get there. But the Soviet army somewhere on the Baltic front uses Sherman tanks. So Western tanks were used by the Soviet army on all sections of the front. And these are Soviet soldiers entering the liberated city of Vyazma. In front is the American medium tank M3's General Lee, supplied to the USSR under Lend-Lease. And these are the same tanks during the Soviet army's offensive somewhere on the Eastern Front. July 1943. And then another similar tank somewhere during the Soviet army's offensive. And these are destroyed American M3 tanks on the streets of the city of Kerch on the Crimean Peninsula. June 1944. Here is the American Sherman tank again. Here it is on the march. This time it is in the units of the 2nd Ukrainian Front, the 17th of March, 1945. And these are Belgorod-Dnestrovsky residents greeting the Soviet soldiers liberators sitting in Ford GPA amphibious vehicles. Such vehicles were very often used by the Soviet army to force water obstacles. And here is the city of Brno, Czech Republic. Soviet army units entered the city on American Sherman tanks. These tanks were used to liberate the Czech Republic. And here are the streets of Bucharest again, the Soviet army and the Valentine tank. Behind it comes a Soviet Tu-34. So these Soviet tanks were also manufactured on American machines and equipment. The gun barrels were cut on American machines. The bearings are American. The rubber on the rollers was supplied from the USA, etc. Here is the parade in Bucharest. As we can see, for some reason only Soviet tanks are presented here. And here Great Britain is preparing to transfer Valentine tanks to the USSR. Soon these tanks will be in the USSR, and then they will go to the front. These are the tanks already at the front in battles. Presumably somewhere on the southwestern front in the Soviet army. And these are the jubilant residents of Sofia, greeting the Soviet soldiers who entered the Bulgarian capital on Valentine tanks. Well, after these troops leave further to Europe, Soviet equipment, Soviet tanks will arrive in the city for the parade. Here is the parade. There are already only T-34s. And for some reason there are no British tanks. But they could not replace the cars. All American. This is the parade in Sofia. Next there will be a British Valentine tank somewhere on the Eastern Front. These are Soviet soldiers leading the offensive. This is another such tank in the Soviet army. And then again Soviet soldiers advance in British Valentine tanks. And this is a British Churchill tank in the Battle of Kursk. It is knocked out, has lost its boots, but continues to fire at the enemy. And this is the Kursk Bulge again. Here, Soviet tankers are advancing on the same Churchill tank. And then there are more Churchill tanks of the Soviet army in the Battle of Kursk. These tanks were also very actively used on the Eastern Front. And these are the factories of Great Britain preparing the Matilda tank for deliveries to the USSR. This is an infantry tank. It also took an active part in the battles on the Eastern Front. Here it is being prepared for shipment to the USSR. As we can see, not only the USA, but also Great Britain took an active part in equipping the Soviet army with weapons, ammunition, equipment, and tanks. These are already in the port, before being sent to the USSR, and will soon end up on the Eastern Front. This is Matilda near St. Petersburg, 1942. Practicing an offensive with infantry. And this is Matilda too on the march somewhere in western Ukraine. The Soviet army is advancing to the west. And here they are already somewhere on the offensive on the German front. And these are American M for Sherman tanks in the Soviet army again. Tankers really loved them. This is the most common Allied tank supplied to the USSR under Lend-Lease. It participated in almost all fronts in the Soviet army. And this does not mean that the Soviet army had no equipment at all. No. The factories of the USSR worked, produced armored vehicles, tanks. But there was not enough of it. This was especially true for cars and trucks. Here the Western Allies, led by the USA, almost completely supplied the USSR with cars. And as for tanks, the number of tanks produced in the USSR was several times greater than the Allies supplied. But this still played a huge role in the fact that the USSR was able to survive the war. The help of the Allies was especially important at the beginning of the war, when the USSR lost its armies with armored vehicles during the invasion of Germany. Although, as the facts showed, later this Allied equipment was very good at liberating Europe. And the almost 13,000 tanks supplied to the USSR is not a small amount. This is twice as many as Germany had when it invaded the USSR. So the role of the Allies in equipping the Soviet army was very great. And then, all these tanks went together with the Soviet ones all the way to Berlin. And the M for Sherman also actively participated in the capture of Berlin. By the way, the Soviet tank crews really liked this tank. The Soviet tank crews really wanted to get their hands on this particular American tank. They wanted to drive it. And that says a lot. It could do things that the Soviet Tu-34 couldn't. For example, the soft suspension of the Sherman chassis allowed the tank to fire accurately while moving at a distance of up to 150 meters. The Tu-34 had to come to a complete stop for this. The Shermans had radios, while the Tu-34 didn't have them at all. The tank crews waved flags at each other, letting each other know what to do and where to go. The M4 sighting systems were better. It had higher penetration. Consequently, the Sherman had better accuracy and firing range. The American tank was inferior in off-road cross-country ability. It also had a very high silhouette. It was easier to spot and hit. It was very high. The armor of the tanks was approximately comparable. The Sherman was much better than the Tu-34 in terms of comfort, convenience, and ease of use. And most importantly, American tanks were much more reliable than Soviet ones. And in battles, this sometimes played a decisive role. A similar situation was with almost all the equipment that the USSR received from the West. The industry of Western countries was more developed. Accordingly, its products were more advanced. But the most important thing is that the Soviet Union needed equipment as quickly as possible, and in as large quantities as possible. After all, its industry could not meet the needs of the army, especially after the German Blitzkrieg and the defeat of the Soviet army. Therefore, the Lend-Lease of the Allies turned out to be a real salvation for the USSR. And this equipment made a significant contribution to the victory. It is on this equipment, among other things, that the Soviet army will counterattack on the Eastern Front, helping the Allies crush the enemy. And it is this equipment and weapons that will lead the Allies to victory. After the victory in Europe, the USSR actually occupied many Eastern European countries. It began to install puppet regimes in them by force. The Allies seriously considered war with the USSR. There were proposals to start a war with the Soviet Union immediately after the victory over Germany. While Soviet troops were concentrated in Central Europe, closer to Western countries. In order to eliminate the communist threat and, in general, this authoritarian regime, the Soviet dictatorship. For example, the Prime Minister of Great Britain Winston Churchill advocated this. Because many Western countries considered the USSR a threat to democracy and freedom. And many countries of Eastern and Central Europe believed that they were occupied by the Soviet Union after the victory over Germany. Among them were Poland, the Baltic countries, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. In general, almost all those who fell under the control of the USSR and in which pro-Soviet governments were formed. But the Western Allies had just ended a long-term large-scale world war. They wanted peace. That's why they didn't want to start a new war, this time with the USSR. But they couldn't help but react to the Soviet Union's occupation of many European countries. So instead of a hot war, a cold war began. The threat of the spread of Bolshevism, socialism and communism in Europe and the world, as well as the military threat to democratic countries from the USSR and Communist China, became the reason for the creation of the NATO bloc. Many of the countries occupied by the Soviet Union became part of the USSR, and many had a puppet pro-Soviet government and were controlled by Moscow. In response to the creation of NATO, they formed a bloc of Warsaw Pact countries. In fact, this is how the Cold War began. The underlying reasons are the occupation of European countries by the Soviet Union. As an example, the uprisings of the people in the Czech Republic and Hungary led to the fact that the USSR introduced its troops into these countries to suppress them. For example, in October-November 1956 to suppress the uprising in Hungary, and in August 1968 in Czechoslovakia. Thus, the USSR occupied and controlled these countries. By military force it supported pro-Soviet puppet regimes in them. In fact, Russia's expansion led to the formation of a new empire called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And it continued its expansion further until the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War led to a global confrontation, including a nuclear one. There was an arms race, an energy war, or the use of oil prices as a weapon. There were also sanctions and isolation of the Soviet Union by the developed world. To strike a blow at the development of its industry and, accordingly, the equipment of its army. And in the same way, military support was used in those countries in which the USSR started wars. To increase Soviet spending on these wars and weaken the economy of the USSR. Also, to prevent the Soviet Union from occupying or subjugating them. All this eventually led to the defeat of the USSR in the Cold War, which resulted in the collapse of the USSR. But that was still a long way off. And in the meantime, after the recent end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, another major war had broken out in the world, which could easily develop into a third World War. So, after the end of World War II, Korea, which was previously controlled by Japan, became free. And then, two military blocs, the bloc of socialist countries and the bloc of democratic countries, divided its territory in half, approximately along the 38th parallel. This was achieved during the end of the war with Japan. So, the northern part of the Korean peninsula began to be called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or DPRK. Although there was only one democracy there. Because the country was recognized as a socialist state by the Constitution. It was ruled by a harsh dictatorship. Like the USSR and China, which supported it, and which were also socialist. At the same time, South Korea began to be called the Republic of Korea. It was supported by the USA and democratic countries of the world in general. Accordingly, capitalism and democracy began to form in the country. This did not suit the USSR and China, which supported it. Apparently, they wanted to unite Korea by force and make it socialist. In other words, to seize it by military means. According to the former chief of the operations department of the General Staff of the North Korean Army, Pak Song-chol, preparations for an attack on South Korea began in the fall of 1948. And the final decision to invade was made after a meeting between North Korean leader Kim Il-sung and Soviet leader Stalin in the spring of 1950. Already on June 25, 1950, the DPRK, with the support of the USSR and the People's Republic of China, will begin a full-scale invasion of South Korea. They will form a northern coalition of states and attack. The aggressor will outnumber the South Korean army many times over in terms of soldiers, aircraft, tanks, artillery, etc. For example, the DPRK army alone had 175,000 people trained by Soviet instructors. And in South Korea, there were only 93,000 trained soldiers. Also, the Northern Coalition had 150 T-34 tanks. The South Koreans had only 30 tanks and self-propelled guns in total. The North Korean coalition had 172 combat aircraft, and the South Korean army had only 40 training aircraft. There were no combat aircraft at all at the time of the attack. Plus, in addition to the North Korean army, Chinese and Soviet troops and specialists could have been used for the invasion. As we can see, the DPRK ground army was much superior to the South Korean army. However, it was the opposite at sea. South Korea dominated there. As a result, after the Northern Coalition began its invasion, the South Korean army began to retreat. It all came to the point that almost the entire Korean peninsula was captured by the North Korean coalition. The South Korean army retreated to the city of Busan, where it was covered by the Navy. By mid-August 1950, approximately 90% of South Korea's territory had been captured. On the day of the beginning of the DPRK invasion of the Republic of Korea, on June 25, the UN Security Council was convened in New York, which boycotted the USSR. There, the US proposal to provide assistance to South Korea was unanimously adopted. The democratic countries of the world supported the US. Thus, the US and UN troops went to help South Korea to defend it from the aggressors. As a result, on September 15, a counter-offensive of the Democratic Coalition of countries and UN troops began. They were supposed to liberate South Korea from the socialist aggressor occupiers. The Allies carried out a number of successful military operations, as a result of which, by the end of September, it became clear that the army of the DPRK and the troops of China and the USSR supporting it had been routed. Then China declared that if the Allies crossed the 38th parallel and entered the territory of North Korea, the Chinese army would intervene on a full scale and bring in its troops. But North Korea was the aggressor. Therefore, on October 8, the Allies crossed the border of the DPRK. The USSR and China, which were behind the North Korean invasion, should have understood that they would also have to answer for such wars. In September-November 1950, the UN counteroffensive almost completely occupied all the territories of North Korea. In fact, the war unleashed by the Soviet Union in Korea was a complete failure. Therefore, the new goal of the war of the USSR and China was an attempt to recapture the territories of North Korea. The Soviet Union was afraid of a world war with Western countries, so it began to help with weapons and equipment, instructors, and provided air cover with MiG-15 aircraft and others. Officially, the USSR troops did not approach closer than 100 kilometers from the border of North Korea. In turn, the PRC was supposed to send its army to save the DPRK. Perhaps the USSR believed that since China did not yet have nuclear weapons, a clash between the Chinese and American armies would avoid a world nuclear war. Even if the US used nuclear weapons, the war would not escalate into a world war. And then everything would be resolved diplomatically. Thus, a huge number of Chinese soldiers fell upon the UN troops in Korea. On October 25, China began its offensive. The UN troops began to retreat under the onslaught of a more numerous enemy. Under such conditions, by January 1951, the UN troops retreated to the 38th parallel. In fact, the troops of the Northern Coalition restored their control over the DPRK. Then the UN troops also began to increase their military contingents in Korea. The US supplied F-86 Sabre fighters. Air battles were widespread. The US and UN allies took control of the airspace. The Chinese army's advance was stopped, and then slightly pushed back to the north. As a result, each side had an army of more than 1 million people. The losses of the sides grew. Most of the territories on the peninsula went through battles and were destroyed. At the same time, the territory of the DPRK was already under Chinese and Soviet control, and the Republic of Korea under UN forces. The parties understood that the war had reached a dead end, and there was an opportunity to resolve the war diplomatically. the US did not use nuclear weapons because their goal was not to seize North Korea but to protect South Korea. Plus, the parties did not need additional losses, as well as the possibility of starting a more global conflict. Thus, on July 8, 1951, the first negotiations began in the ancient capital of Korea, the city of Kaesong. However, the war continued. The goal of the UN was to restore the Korean Republic on pre-war territories. China agreed to this solution. But the USSR, apparently, refused. The war continued throughout 1951 and 1952. There were many large-scale military operations on both sides. However, the front line practically did not move. It froze approximately along the 38th parallel. The US and the UN carried out major bombing raids on North Korea. At the same time, the UN air defense in South Korea reliably protected the country from enemy air attacks. Everything was not in favor of the aggressor, not in favor of the USSR. But the Soviet dictator Stalin continued the war anyway. As soon as democratic countries of the UN and the USA tried to conclude peace, but they failed because of the position of the USSR. The turning point was the death of dictator Stalin. After that, the government of the USSR voted for an immediate end to the Korean War. China, without the support of the USSR, also accepted the terms of peace. As a result, the peace treaty was signed on July 27, 1953. At the suggestion of India to the UN. The border between North and South Korea was to be on the pre-war 38th parallel. Also, in connection with the aggression, it was decided to create a demilitarized zone between the republics. It was to pass through the territory of the aggressor, which was done. Thus, the territory of North Korea even slightly decreased, mainly due to this demilitarized zone. From all this it follows that the aggressors in the form of the USSR, China, and North Korea suffered a defeat. They were unable to capture and occupy South Korea. This means that all the goals of the attack were failed. And the fact that the main instigator of the war was the USSR is evidenced by the fact that peace was achieved only after the death of the leader of the USSR, Stalin. Before that, all attempts at peace negotiations failed. As a result, at the end of the Korean War, the DPRK will become a tough dictatorship with an authoritarian regime and will be under international sanctions, in isolation. In fact, it will become a world outcast. The problem of the DPRK will not only be poverty and misery of the population. Famine will be a frequent phenomenon in the country. And South Korea will turn into one of the most developed countries in the world. With a high scientific and cultural level of development, developed democracy, economy, and industry. South Korean goods will become known throughout the world and will be in great demand. The country will become one of the world's leaders in the production of modern electronics, the automotive industry, innovations in various fields of science and technology, etc. In general, judge for yourself who won and who lost. It must be said that the Korean War was a defeat for the USSR. And the aggression against the independent and free Korean Republic turned the USSR, China, and the DPRK into the so-called axis of evil. Later, some other authoritarian dictatorships of the world will join this axis of evil. This only increased tensions in the Cold War, in which the USSR will also lose in the future. It is precisely about the defeat of the USSR in the Cold War, as well as a number of other wars, that we will talk in our next fourth part of the video review. You will learn which wars contributed to its collapse and why. And that's all from me. Special thanks from the author to everyone who helps the channel. Your help is very important. Like, comment and subscribe to the channel, where many more interesting videos await you. Thanks for watching. And see you soon with new videos. Peace and goodness to all.